Hello, welcome to the lecture on biodiversity in Chapter 11. We're going to talk about biodiversity, the value of biodiversity, threats to it, and what's being done to preserve biodiversity in this lecture. Biodiversity is a broad term used to describe the variety of life. More formally, biodiversity is the variability among living organisms from all sources, including terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes which they're part of. This includes variation in genetic, phenotypic, phylogenetic or evolutionary relationships, and functional attributes, as well as changes in the abundance and distribution over time and space within and among species, communities, and ecosystems. We can look at biodiversity by counting up the number of different types or variants at various levels of a hierarchy: genes within populations, populations within species, species within communities and ecosystems within landscapes and the overall biosphere. It also recognizes that nature is dynamic and that biodiversity changes over both time and space. So if your goal is to prevent extinction, is it enough to save one population of something, say elephants? Why or why not? So if we look at this figure here, we've got biodiversity at different levels, right? Genes within genomes or individuals, populations, species, ecosystems. And we want to be able to preserve all these levels of biodiversity. So if you save just a single population of elephants, eventually they'll become inbred. You have to have multiple populations for migration to occur between, so there can be gene flow to help maintain biodiversity. Or your one single population needs to be extremely large. All right, so some vocabulary terms for you here. Species richness. In practice, this is the most common measure of biodiversity, and it's just the total number of species present in an ecosystem. There are 2.2 million described species on Earth today, and this is a large underestimate. Estimates of total diversity of all organisms range from billions to trillions. There are a lot of undescribed organisms still on planet Earth yet to be named and discovered or described by science. Here's some examples of species diversity. So we have different evolutionary groups here in the circles, and the number of species within each group on the y-axis. So as we go higher up, they have more and more species. All right, so also notice that the more red there is in the circle around the animal, the more, like the greater percent of those species within that group are threatened with extinction. So we've got mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fishes, and sharks and rays. So most of your common larger animals have fewer species. They have less biodiversity than simpler animals or animals with older evolutionary histories like dragonflies, snails, crustaceans, and corals. These have much greater species diversity than the vertebrates. And plants are much older, evolutionarily speaking, and they have a much greater biodiversity. Ferns, cycads, conifers, monocots like grasses and corn, and legumes. So if you notice, there's a relationship between biodiversity and evolutionary time. The older a group is, the more species diversity it has. And the younger a group is, the less species diversity it has. Species richness can vary tremendously from place to place and over time in the same place. Two most important factors that determine the number of species in any area are energy and water. And this results in a latitudinal gradient of diversity for many organisms. greatest diversity, the warmest colors, are usually located nearest the equator. And the further you move away from the equator, the less energy there is, the less diversity we find in those places. There are several other factors that can influence species richness in an area, like the geological and evolutionary history of the region, the size of the area, and the degree of isolation. So remember what you know about island biogeography. Not all islands are surrounded by water. For example, here's an island of forest habitat surrounded by a sea of agricultural matrix, right? How is the size of a nature preserve related to the extinction risk of the organisms who live there? So do you think the organisms in this little patch of forest here are more likely to go extinct, or organisms that live in a large national park like Yellowstone? Right. The bigger the area, the greater the likelihood of continued existence into the future, or the lower the likelihood of extinction. All right, now let's talk about genetic diversity. This refers to the number of and different types or variants of DNA within a population, species, or community. The amount of genetic variation. While genetic diversity is high, the chance is high of having beneficial genetic variants that could provide a major advantage in the face of a new challenge. Think of disease, right? If a new disease comes along and a population has a lot of diversity in its genes, it's more likely that just by chance, some individuals will happen to be immune to that disease. Whereas if it's a population that's highly inbred and has low genetic diversity, a disease could easily wipe out the whole population. All right, and we can examine various aspects of genetic diversity across the entire genome of a species to learn how well it can withstand a range of possible challenges. In portions of the genome involved in response to a particular threat, for example, the diversity of immune genes in the face of a new disease, and the number and distribution of genetically distinct populations. A good example here of genetic conservation success is the black-footed ferrets. So black-footed ferrets were reduced to fewer than 20 individuals. They were brought into captivity and captive bred, and those breedings were chosen specifically by biologists to preserve as much genetic diversity as possible. And then eventually, when we had enough black-footed ferrets in captivity, they were released back out into the wild in the Dakotas, and they have been a really successful reintroduction there of black-footed ferrets. All right, beyond the number of variants. So we must distinguish between species richness and species diversity. Species diversity takes into account the number and evenness of species. Communities with more even abundances among the species are more diverse. So if you compare Community 1, where there's 4 species and they're evenly distributed, to Community 2, where there's still 4 different species of trees present, but 80% are all species A, which has a greater biodiversity. Well, the one with more species evenness, right? All right, humans depend on the value of biodiversity and functioning of ecosystems. And we call nature's contributions to people, we'll abbreviate that as NCPs. And some ways to understand and recognize those contributions, both positive and negative, of living nature to people's quality of life. We have 3 categories: regulating, material, and non-material. So let's talk about the value of biodiversity. Variation in biodiversity affects ecosystem functioning, and as the number of species in a community decreases, so do measures of ecosystem function. For example, in experimental grasslands, increasing plant diversity increases productivity, the efficiency of nutrient use, and the efficiency of nutrient retention. Why does ecosystem functioning increase with increasing biodiversity? Well, in diverse communities, there's a higher probability of having species present that make more efficient use of the resources. We have a higher probability of having species that are particularly effective in carrying out an important process. There's a greater number of species that use resources in different ways, and they're complementary to one another. More diverse communities are more resistant. They remain largely the same even when faced with the potentially damaging disturbance. They're resilient. They return to their original state after being affected by a disturbance. Assigning value to nature. So there are some direct economic assessments where we can convert NCPs into monetary terms, and estimates are in the trillions. We also have option values. We can't predict which aspects will help maintain the stability and integrity of our natural systems in a changing world, especially with climate change, right? And assigning value to maintaining future options to ensure human well-being is a challenging task. There are also non-material values, and these are especially difficult to estimate. They have benefits to physical, psychological, and social well-beings are clear, however. And there's intrinsic value. Species have a fundamental right to exist without their survival being challenged by humans. Nature has a value in its own right, and there's an ethical position that is unrelated to social or economic considerations. So which conservationists might argue that the intrinsic value of nature is our moral responsibility to protect? All right, threats to biodiversity. So the growth of the human population and how we consume resources drives biodiversity loss. There are indirect factors that drive more direct threats to biodiversity as well. So if we look over here, we have human population size, which of course is growing larger by the day, right? There are indirect drivers like the population growth, consumption of resources, our technology, economics and trade, policies and governance, and conflict and epidemics. There are also direct drivers, things that directly increase or decrease biodiversity. Climate change, habitat loss, degradation, overexploitation or overharvest, invasive species, and pollution. All these things work together to increase biodiversity loss. Let's talk specifically about some of these threats. So habitat loss is one of the greatest. Natural or human activities damage and destroy habitats. The original habitat's no longer capable of supporting the species and communities that naturally occur there. This can occur on land and in freshwater and marine ecosystems. So this is a picture of slash and burn agriculture. It looks like in the tropical rainforest, like the Amazon. Habitat loss on land removes natural communities for agriculture, mining, forestry, and urbanization. In water, habitat can be lost by dredging, drainage and diversions, siltation, and disturbance at the bottom, like certain forms of fishing. Another major threat to biodiversity is habitat loss through agriculture, and this is the leading cause of terrestrial habitat loss. 50% of habitable land is being converted to agricultural land, and 3/4 of available freshwater resources are being used for agriculture. Rangelands, like grazing lands, now occupy 70% of arid and semi-arid lands, and overgrazing in these areas can lead to desertification. If you graze cattle or sheep too long in one area, they can destroy the plant life such that it won't come back, and it actually converts that ecosystem type from a rangeland into a desert. There are some strategies, however, to reduce the impacts of agriculture, increasing the productivity of our existing agricultural land. For example, new methods of irrigation, crop rotation, harvesting, or having new crop varieties, so using some alternative agricultural methods. We can also increase the capacity of the land we have already devoted to agriculture to support more biodiversity. We can maintain non-farmed patches. We could mimic natural vegetation, like shade-grown crops. Deforestation is another major threat to habitat loss, a factor of habitat loss, and that's the process of clearing a land of trees. Forests are being lost rapidly in some regions, and there are strategies to reduce these impacts, like reforestations or using alternative products to wood. Habitat degradation is another threat to biodiversity, and this is a decline in the quality of existing habitats. Degraded habitats no longer support the same species and or number of individuals. It goes hand in hand with habitat loss. Consider habitat fragmentation, which is just the change in the shape and configuration of remaining habitat after habitat loss occurs. So if you were to look at these maps, the green, we'll say, is forest. And in the year 1831, there was a large contiguous patch of forest here. But every 50 years, the forest became more and more fragmented and broken up into smaller and fewer pieces. This has a huge impact on the number and size of populations that can be supported. Some effects of habitat fragmentation include initial crowding, a loss of species requiring large areas of habitat, isolation of fragments, small populations prone to extinction, edge effects, a loss of specialists, and an increase in the proportion of generalist species. Habitat degradation. Some strategies to reduce the impacts are to maintain larger areas of habitat and provide corridors to connect fragments, like these wildlife overpasses. And here's a forest corridor to connect forest patches in an agricultural area, and having proper planning. Next, it's overexploitation. When humans use or extract a resource to the point of exhaustion or extinction, and it often results from unregulated or illegal harvest. More than 30% of endangered species of animals and 8% of plants are threatened by overexploitation. So that's loss due to humans going out and physically removing those animals from the population, usually by hunting. All right, overexploitation in aquatic systems. Nearly 90% of global fisheries are overexploited. We're removing too many fish from oceans and lakes and rivers. In many areas, protein from fish and invertebrates is the primary source of protein in people's diets. They also harvest aquatic organisms for ornaments, for the aquarium trade, for medicine or dyes and other products. And there can also be bycatch. That's when species that aren't the target species also get caught and killed. This is where like dolphin safe tuna came from. It used to be, I want to say in the 90s. When tuna fishermen would go out, they'd use these nets and they'd catch a lot of tuna, but they'd also end up catching and killing accidentally some dolphins that would get in there. So now when you buy a can of tuna at the store, it should say dolphin safe on the label, which means that they're using a fishing practice that allows the dolphins to escape so that they're not also killing dolphins when they catch the tuna. All right, and overexploitation in terrestrial systems. This could be hunting for food, for animal parts like ivory or rhinoceros horn, or for the pet and aquarium trade. Like this little guy here is a spotted turtle. It's endangered in Michigan, and it's threatened mostly by people collecting it for pets. Species introductions is another threat to biodiversity. So this would be the transport of species outside of their native range. Sometimes it's intentional. For example, crops, sport fish, or ornamental plants like Phragmites. But it could be unintentional, like zebrafish hitching a ride in bilge water in ships to the Great Lakes. There are many different pathways of species introductions that differ in the degree of intentionality. So how they got here. They could be released, escapes, they could be a contaminant or a stowaway, or maybe we've unintentionally created a corridor that allows organisms to move. Not all species introductions are successful. Species may be introduced but later go extinct. And a good example of this one is pheasants, ring-necked pheasants. Those were brought over from Europe to Michigan for sportsmen to hunt. They do exist in the wild, but usually not for long. They don't do very well in Michigan without a lot of help and support from people. So although they're non-native, ring-necked pheasants are not invasive in Michigan because they're not displacing native species. But other species do become invasive when they spread and cause harm to the native communities. They may have major economic consequences for humans. So a good example of this would be like a big head carp in the Mississippi River. Those are the carp that when they hear the vibrations from motors, they jump out of the water and sometimes knock over people in boats. Invasive species interact with native species as predators, competitors, and sometimes even parasites. They affect community structure and they affect ecosystem processes. For example, they may impact nutrient cycling and they may affect the frequency of disturbances. Some strategies to reduce the impacts of species introductions could be eradication, but this is usually difficult and expensive. It's sometimes impossible to manage. You could manage existing populations and limit the spread. There are physical methods like hunting or trapping or spraying an herbicide, or you could manage predators, parasites, or competitors. The best strategy would be to prevent these introductions altogether. And you can identify and manage introduction pathways, economic incentives, policies, educate people, and making informed personal choices. Climate change we'll discuss in greater detail in Chapter 17, but climate change results in increased and more variable temperatures on land and in the ocean. It alters patterns of precipitation. It makes weather events more extreme and changes in ocean levels and acidity. So how is climate change introducing new species? Well, as the climate warms, organisms are able to extend their ranges closer to the poles. So we see things changing like opossums, like we have in Michigan, are able to spend the winters further north than they ever have before because of global climate change. So they're shifting their range. We see similar things with the mosquito that carries Zika virus. Never used to be a problem in Florida, but in recent years it's crept up into Florida and brought Zika virus with it. Climate change affects individuals, in their growth and survival, and also with heat and water stress. It affects populations' distributions and increases their susceptibility to other threats and the timing of important events. And it affects communities by impacting their structure, the interactions between species, and the flow of energy and matter. Multiple drivers act together to threaten biodiversity, and many drivers act simultaneously in any given system or region. For example, tropical deforestation and also chytridiomycosis in amphibians. So this is a fungus that will kill frogs very quickly. You can have more than one threat happening at the same time, and that often makes the impacts much worse than it would be with either one alone. And we call those factors synergistic, which might ring a bell with your biospheres. If you have two different factors impacting a population at the same time, it can be the outcome can be different than the result of each of those factors on their own. So it's the total impact of two or more threats is greater than what you'd expect from the impact of each threat on its own. All right, so what are some broad outcomes we can expect with biodiversity? Well, extinction, global extinction. So no member of a species remains alive anywhere in the world. So that could be something that can happen for some species. Local extinctions, where a species no longer found in an area once inhabited but still occurs elsewhere. Right? That would be like bison in Michigan. We don't have wild bison here anymore, but we used to. Certain species are more likely to become extinct than others. Some factors that affect the probability of extinction are the size of the populations, the geographic area where they can be found, whether they're specialists in their niche or if they're generalists, and their reproductive rates. Biotic homogenization. So this is something that happens as specialists are replaced by generalists as habitats become more degraded. So like if you were to go to an urban setting, you might find rats, you might find raccoons, maybe even coyotes, but you wouldn't find pine marten or black bears. You wouldn't find sockeye salmon, things that are really specialists in their habitats that require more pristine habitats to survive. So what's being done to preserve biodiversity? Well, we have species level approaches, listings and legal protections like the IUCN Red List. This carries out species assessments and categorizes the threat to species as critically endangered, or vulnerable. What's among these species level approaches, there are listings and legal protections like the U.S. Endangered Species Act, which has a mandate to create and maintain a list of endangered and threatened species, identify and protect critical habitat, and develop recovery programs. We also have CITES, which aims to ensure that international trade in wild animals and plants does not threaten their survival. Species-level approaches also include population assessments and management. We can do censuses to monitor changes in population sizes over time and how populations respond to changes in their environment. Demographic studies include rates of growth, reproduction and survival, the percentage of breeding adults, a number of populations, and movement between those populations. We can also do population assessments and management that include habitat management and habitat modifications made to enhance the success of a species. For example, a prescribed burn. This can spur germination of species that haven't been seen in that area for 30 years or more. Seeds can hang out in the seed bank down in the soil, and when conditions are right, like after a burn, they can germinate and grow. All right, another option is to establish new populations. Species are released in a site in which it used to occur. For example, pine marten were successfully reintroduced to the Manistee National Forest. Or population augmentation, where individuals are released into an existing population to increase its size and gene pool, like bringing additional wolves to Isle Royale. There are also some ex situ approaches, so temporarily maintaining individuals in artificial conditions, like the long-term goal of establishing them back in the wild. For example, with the black-footed ferrets, They were preserved in a captive breeding facility, but then later reintroduced into the wild. Zoos, aquaria, botanical gardens, and seed banks also serve the same purpose. We have protected areas as well to manage ecosystem and landscapes. The United Nations Convention on Biodiversity's Aichi biodiversity targets has a goal of designating 17% of terrestrial and inland water areas and 10% of coastal and marine areas as protected by the year 2020. I'm not sure if we met that goal. They may be designated and managed by governments, for example, national or state parks, private land trusts, and conservancies. All right, ecosystem and landscape approaches can also include ecological restoration, the return of an ecosystem to its original state, rehabilitation, which improves a system relative to its degraded state, and reclamation, which is the restoration of highly degraded sites. We can also have regional ecosystem planning. Planning protected areas, managed lands, and human activities may coexist across the landscape. Scale and complexity can be large, and this attempt to balance an ecosystem conservation and human well-being. So in summary, the loss of biodiversity has become a major concern. Ecosystems involve the interactions of organisms and their physical environment. And functioning ecosystems and their component organisms provide many valuable services that are often overlooked because they're not easily measured in economic terms. Many people also consider the loss of biodiversity to be an ethical problem, and the primary causes of habitat loss are by humans converting ecosystems to agriculture and grazing lands, overexploitation by harvesting species at unsustainable levels, introduction of exotic species that disrupt ecosystems and compete or prey on native organisms, and purposeful killing of pest organisms such as large predators. Protection of biodiversity typically involves legal protections by national laws and international agreements and the management of the use of species and ecosystems at sustainable levels. All right, thank you for watching, and as always, please make sure you bring your questions to class or to office hours so we can chat about them.